All right, welcome everybody. Thank you for coming tonight. The Sustainable Beekeepers Guild of Michigan is happy to have John Schwartz here with us, and we're going to talk about on-the-spot queen rearing for the summer solstice primarily, which is coming up quickly and is a milestone for the OTS system, which should be very beneficial to many folks who are looking to increase their bees in their apiary. A little bit about the Sustainable Beekeepers Guild of Michigan. And our mission. It is a collaborative and thoughtful mission fostered through education and intelligent dialogue. And I am not sharing video, sorry about that. Sorry. Intelligent dialogue and practice that will carry out natural management of honeybees in Michigan, utilizing scientific principles grounded in naturalist theory, whilst promoting the chief end of a chemical-free and sustainable method of beekeeping and honey making. Our chief objective, though, is to foster and develop a region of local genetics focused on raising, exchanging, and utilizing local resources. So the Guild will focus on education, fostering and support of hobbyists and sideliners to propagate local, sustainable survivor honeybee genetics and improve drone breeding populations that complement chemical-free and survival queen rearing practices. Although it is open to beekeepers, hobbyists, sideliners, and the rest, the SBGMI primarily discourages prophylactic use of chemical treatments and defers to physical or mechanical manipulations and interventions first. If you don't know what a prophylactic treatment is, it's very simply just treating for the sake of treating without knowing what your purpose of treatment is. And sometimes that's a necessary option for people because of their circumstances, but in principle, we discourage that so you have a better option of understanding and choosing and breeding from the stock that is surviving and capable of surviving without the use of the chemical treatment. So the ultimate end is that it results in a culture striving to increase local colony resilience to pathogens, diseases, and reduce the risk and occurrence of treatment resistance and Varroa destructor mites and other honeybee maladies. Because just like certain diseases and viruses and bacteria can be resistant to treatments, so too can Varroa destructor, and have demonstrated sufficiently that they are resisting some treatments themselves. So it can have a negative impact in that regard, that we are not only breeding stronger mites, but we're losing the battle and breeding better bees. So a couple of upcoming events for the Bee Guild. We'll just kind of go over these briefly. For the month of July, we will have some more presentations from Corey Stevens of Stevens Bee Company in Missouri. We've also invited Trevor Bawden from Lloyd Street Bees, and they will be here to discuss the VSH queen rearing practices, and hopefully just in time for you to employ some of it in your own apiaries for the month of July, maybe even August, depending on how risky you are. For the month of August, we have Troy Hall from Hall Apiaries in Vermont, and he will be here to talk about the economics of treatment-free beekeeping. He currently manages over 200 colonies. 100 of them he's running for honey, and another 100 or so he's running for queen rearing. And you can see the website there if you wanted to check into him and get some information and background on him. So for the month of September, we are talking to a couple of people to come here and speak about integrated pest management strategies for the fall. Yeah, we do discourage prophylactic treatment, but that doesn't mean that we are not tolerant of integrated pest management principles and, you know, deferring to physical and biomechanical strategies before you have to break out the chemicals, making smart decisions based on what it is that you're assessing and seeing in your colonies and treating accordingly. As far as October is concerned, if you've heard of them or you haven't, Eddie and Tardif will join us to discuss winterization strategies so you can prepare you for a successful winter in Michigan. Venting, not venting, those kinds of things that are important when it comes to prepping for your winter strategy. And there's his website if you want to get some more information. A lot of his stuff is already out there on YouTube, various presentations in other clubs, but we'll have them for our own, and we get to pick his brain and ask our own questions. A little bit about membership benefits for the Sustainable Beekeepers Guild of Michigan. All members get 10 hours of streaming video on the Sustainable Beekeeping conference through the Guild website, which is pretty neat. We also are streaming some of those videos free monthly. So each month we have a video selected for your perusal on Vimeo. Those are posted to the Facebook group for those who wish to access it. and share it for the month of June. You also get a 6-month digital subscription to Natural Bee Husbandry magazine, which I think is a really spectacular magazine. Lots of very thoughtful topics when it comes to natural bee husbandry. There's also an option for discounts on American Bee Journal and Bee Culture magazines. So I'm not biased, I read them all. Also, membership benefits include a group queen order discount, so you save on shipping expenses for awesome queens when you participate with the club. You get free shipping on most orders. We try to absorb the cost of the shipping, which brings the price of those queens you want to ship from out of state down from $100 to $20, $25, $30, which makes it a little more accessible for you to improve your own apiary with these queens. Don't forget, you have the option to go to the merchandise site on the Bee Guild, and you can get your very own t-shirt to sport our snazzy logo, some of them with interesting quips and quotes. And we are always open to suggestions for eye catchers to draw attention to the club, and all the sales from these items benefit the club, beekeeper education, spreading the word, and helping other beekeepers with their own efforts. Now for our presentation tonight, we have On the Spot Queen Rearing with John Schwartz. And I first learned of John, I think I saw one of his video presentations, and I thought it was a very thoughtful, very linear and purposeful presentation that helps you kind of digest the principles that are inherent in Mel Disselkoen's OTS Queen Rearing book. And he also adds a lot of information from his personal experience. John lives in Randolph, Ohio. He's married and has 6 children, ages 13 to 27. Originally from the West Coast and most recently Alaska before he moved to Ohio in 2011. His day job is a digital manager, and beekeeping, something that keeps him sane on the side, which is interesting as a social worker because there's nothing sane about beekeeping. It's all craziness all the time. He began beekeeping in 2006 in Oregon and maintains a small blog. You can find that at thebee.farm, or you can join the OTS Facebook group, which he helps manage, facebook.com/groups, OTS Beekeeping. John enjoys helping beekeepers become self-sufficient and can always be reached via email with questions at johnschwartz@gmail.com, and that's spelled like the name on the screen, all running together. Without further ado, I'm going to terminate my slideshow. I'm going to hand that over to you, John.
Sounds good. Thanks, James. I'll pull up my presentation. And I've got chat open and love to just take questions all the way through this. So don't feel like you're intruding or butting in. Just feel free with the questions. I'll keep an eye on it. And we'll pause and answer questions as we've got time. And at the end, we can even take any remaining questions and turn on your audio and talk. That's easier that way. No big deal. So this is fun. Bees do keep me sane, but I hear you, James. Sometimes I wonder, why am I doing this? So I hear you. I want to talk tonight to you all. It's a nice group. I love the principles, James, you laid out, and totally agree. For the most part, I don't really disagree with anything, and it's really the way we need to be heading. And the more of us that are on board with that, the better for us and the bees. I want to talk about efficiently increasing your colonies and never buying bees again. That's been my experience the last over 10 years now since moving to Ohio and learning a few things, and we'll get into that. Just a picture of my family, a recent wedding last summer. So all of my kids, 4 girls and 2 boys, and then a couple new daughters-in-law and a little grandchild there. He's 1 now, William. I was born in California, grew up in Washington, and married my wife in Oregon and lived all over the place there. And then we moved to Alaska for better or worse for a couple of years. I loved it, but my wife didn't. So we came back, and job took me to Ohio, living most recently on a little 10-acre farm. It's been a dream. It just landed in our lap, old farmhouse and pasture and some trees and garden, and we're busy with ramping bees back up again. I started bees in 2005-ish with top bar hives, what I started out with. I started the hard way, and which was interesting. And eventually migrated back to Langstroth and I've been there since. So, you know, I'm not selling anything. I do just want to help. Happy, really want to answer questions and try and help you get some of the principles we're going to talk about. I'm not claiming to be an expert. I'm just have a little bit of experience and success with learning from others. I want to pass that on to you. And I'm not claiming there's a right way to keep bees, although I do have opinions, which is good. We all need to. So what we'll cover: a strategy for increasing colonies without spending money, 3 problems, 3 solutions for those problems, those strategies in pictures in my apiary to help you kind of grasp that a little bit more, some extra suggestions, and then we can just talk about any questions you have along the way. So current realities that I hear and experience as I help others with beekeeping. Things like it's hard keeping bees alive, or I'm spending too much money. Should I be treating for mites? I need to buy bees again this year. I'm intimidated by the idea of raising queens. I lost all of my bees last winter. It's much harder to keep bees these days. And I've said all those things and meant it. I don't look at this as a negative, but just the evolution of folks walking through the experience of trying to raise bees. They're not easy to raise. Mites have changed everything, and there's a lot of hard lessons to learn, and everything's different every year. The longer you're in it, the more you know that. If you're in any kind of agriculture or farming, and this, I think especially bees, it's just nuts sometimes. So the current paradigm amongst most beekeepers that I see, I think that's starting to change, but I still see it in here because there's a lot of new beekeepers always coming into the fold. Most are still buying queens or packages every year or two, usually from out of state because they're losing their bees and end up spending lots of money and not breaking even. They're losing bees in the fall, winter, and early spring, and then that cycle repeats. And unfortunately, some get out of it because they just don't want to spend the money, or it's too hard, or they're just not having success. So I think the principles we're going to talk about can get you on your way to breaking through this and enjoy, for the most part, doing bees, except for when it's hot and there's a lot of hard work in front of you every once in a while. 3 problems. Number 1 is losing bees to swarms. And I used to all the time. I remember buying this very expensive queen in Washington State from the Olympic Mountains and watched it fly down the street for the first time and lost all heart in raising bees and wondering what I was doing, and crazy. When they swarm, that obviously greatly weakens your colony. You lose productive queen and bees typically if you don't catch them. Most don't. You lose honey, you lose time. It all adds up to be an expensive mistake that most folks often perpetuate needlessly. Number 2, not raising your own queens. I used to buy them like everybody every year, and when that happens, you're dependent on others, and you can be taking part in a genetic bottleneck if you're buying from the big producers. If you're more in a program of sharing locally, that's a different story. You are working on somebody else's timetable for those queens. Queens are often typically from out of state. You have no guarantee as to quality or longevity. You don't know the history of that queen. And that can also add up to an expensive situation. The reality is a lot of queens get superseded, fail, aren't what they are worth. And there's just a lot of issues with not learning how to raise your own. And then 3, losing bees to mites, probably the crux of the issue. I used to worry about mites often, especially moving to Ohio. In the early years in Oregon, mites got there late. It was hardly even talked about, never thought about them. When I came to the Midwest here more, I started to hear about and experience issues, and did a lot of research at that point. I still believe it is our number 1 issue. We all have mites all the time. Mites weaken bees, which get sick. Mites must be addressed or you lose colonies instead of healthy hives. Many beekeepers are commonly battling weakness and dwindling symptoms. So don't need to tell you all that. You all already know it. That's just the 3 problems that really at the foundation, the 3 legs in the stool that we got to address. So the 3 strategies to address that we'll get into. And before that, I just want to say I learned all the stuff I'm sharing, I basically learned from Mel and from subsequent experience, testing and trying and thinking. I met Mel at the Tri-County Beekeepers Convention in Worcester, Ohio, back when I think it was the winter of 2011. And heard him talking to a couple Amish guys, and something he said, I don't remember what, really piqued my interest. So I spent money on his book. It's like a spiral bound, wide book. It's probably 100 pages or so. It's very expensive, but very much worth every penny over the years. I just thinking about the idea that I've not bought bees now for over 10 years since, how much is that worth? And so he lives in Michigan as well, Mel Disselkoen, and his website is mbasplitter.com. He invented a couple things back in the past. That's what that name is about. And he coined the term OTS, or on the spot queen rearing. And that's been his thing. And he documents all of that and kind of his history in the book, lays out a lot of different ways to look at it. And that's where I began. And so my experience since buying that book, and it made sense to me, so I just decided to go for it. And since 2012, I've been able to keep my bees in my yard unless I was gone and negligent, which happened this year. I've raised hundreds of my own quality queens that produce well. I've sold hundreds of nukes. I've been able to mitigate mites. I don't worry about mites at all, ever anymore. I've typically got healthy bees. I'm supporting local genetics. That's been my experience. And as well, I'd guess an average annual loss of 25%. I just lost one hive this last winter. Got them all through. This I didn't have many. I think it was just 10 or 12 hives. Since I downgraded after moving to the farm here. But I'm able to help others. Typically, I got tons of brood and queens and bees and honey and comb, whatever folks need, I can help. I have plenty of resources at all times to work with in my own apiary, and I'm able to be ruthless with weak colonies. I don't worry any longer about losing bees. And so if there's a weakness or something I don't like, or a sign of some kind of sickness, I just get rid of them and move on, and don't waste time and efforts and risk trying to prop up an unhealthy queen or colony. So I'm always having young queens and bees going into winter because of these principles we're going to look at. I actually make a profit. I've made net profit every year since. And some years when I've really invested in selling bees and doing a little marketing, I've made a lot of money. And I actually, for the most part, except for those hot days, enjoy beekeeping again. I'm one of those German guys who don't like to get hot. They call me an angry bee when I'm hot. So strategy number one, let's talk about preventing swarming with these OTS principles. It's not an easy task. This is from a quote from the Beekeeper's Handbook, 4th edition. There's a lot of good scientific data in this book, hardback. It's a big book. It's worth the money as well. Swarming was once considered a sign of good and productive beekeeping, for the beekeepers could increase their holdings from the numerous swarms available. That's just the way folks used to do it. They'd sit outside their skeps and capture the swarms as they came out. Straw skeps, logs, other type of cramped hives have been used to house bees since the 1600s, but these containers quickly became overcrowded and promoted the swarming of bees. It's given to the red sentence. Although most beekeepers make efforts to prevent or control swarming, it's not an easy task. Basically, for the most part, swarming is viewed as a sign of beekeeper negligence now, although there's some of the mind that it's healthy and that's what you should promote, not get in the way of it. That's fine. Living in the neighborhood most of my life, I had to mitigate swarms. I didn't want the city to come and take my bees. That's probably most people's experience. So it's something that if you can control, it sure would be great to control it. So it's not easy to prevent. And once they're in swarm mode, as you know, they start making those cups and filling them. There's not much you can do aside from a lot of hard work, splitting up the colonies and spacing the frames and all sorts of things you can do. It can work, but it's a lot of effort. So what do we do? Here's a strategy. We're past it, but in the spring, in summary, 1 week before swarm season, what we do is for each colony, we make an artificial swarm. So this would happen obviously before the swarm impulse begins. So before they are beginning to make queen cell cups and filling those and getting into that behavior, they stop feeding the queen and thinning her up, getting her ready for a flight. And in my experience, since switching to this method, that's outdated number, it's 10 years ago, on hundreds of colonies, it works 99% of the time to prevent swarming. So if I just do some of this basic artificial swarming in May, typically, end of April, early May for us here in Northern Ohio. For you guys, maybe more likely early May, typically to mid-May, maybe later. You just don't see swarming, and as long as you work the system. So here's the outline of an artificial swarm. I'll do it in text, and then I'll show you some pictures as well, because we both, we all learn in different ways. So let's just say swarm season is about the end of the first week in May. And usually this year was an aberration for us, but typically I start counting as soon as I see the first dandelions. 20 days later is going to be roughly the swarm date. And that's all really based on weather and nectar flow, and just something you have to learn, something that you can lean on your local club each year if you're new to beekeeping, to help you understand what's it looking like this year. What do you guys think? And start asking that question in April. But 1 week before we think swarm season would occur, that's a great question, Tammy. Number one, from an overwintered colony, you would pull out an artificial swarm with the queen. So the first thing you do would be a colony inspection, and you start opening it up and looking for where the fresh eggs are, and you're going to find the queen. Typically, the colonies are much smaller and easier to, less bees, easier to find the queen. And you're going to pull her out and make a nucleus colony, as small as possible, and we'll talk about that. And number two, in the original and now queenless colony, you're going to notch below 36-hour or less larvae on multiple frames. And if you're going to graft and raise your own queens, it's the same thing. You'd be grafting with that same age larva that just have emerged from the egg, are laying down in a little C comma in the bottom of the cell with just a tad bit of royal jelly that they're in. Interesting timing that for you guys, very late. So that's the first step. Another way to do this visually is you've got your queen right colony sitting there. You've got a strong queen right colony, typically with at least 5 or 6 frames of brood full of bees, lots of honey. And the first step is you're going to pull her out, and you're going to make sure that this queen right colony in green has the queen, 2 frames of brood, capped brood, not open brood, but capped, and a couple of frames of honey and pollen, if you got it. And the rest you just fill up with whatever you've got. And you shake in an extra frame or 2 of nurse bees, not necessarily required, but smart. And this queen right colony now seems small and very weak. In one sense it is, but in another sense, as you know, if you've been in beekeeping, that frame of brood will emerge out really quickly and just fill that box up, and they'll burn through those couple frames of honey, but they'll start adding to it really quickly, and that'll be a mature colony a month later. It'll really surprise you how fast that nucleus will build. Back in that original now queenless colony, there's no queen, and you've notched a couple of frames. We'll talk about what it means to notch in a bit with some pictures. Basically, you're just helping the colony recognize they need to build a queen, and you're just giving them a little assist. It's not necessarily required. In fact, I don't really worry about notching sometimes. They'll still build queen cells. Sometimes, especially if it's older, darker comb, I'll make sure actually that I notch, because they have a hard time being interested in building queen cells as much on old comb as opposed to fresh comb. And that's one good reason to notch. Step 2, a week later, you're going to come back. So you're going to not touch those colonies for a whole week. Take some patience. There'll be a temptation to get in there and mess around and see how they're doing. Don't do it. You can get in the way and make a mistake. So just wait a week. I typically do this on a Saturday. So the next Saturday I come out, go to the apiary again and go look at the nukes I made with the queens in them and make sure all's well. They're still there, they're building out, and she's laying and everything's fine. Typically that takes a minute or two and you can see, yep, they took, everything's fine. And then step 2 is you go back to the queenless, mature, larger queenless colony that now will have queen cells fully developed and capped. And what you want to do is you go through all those brood frames and you will cull all the queen cells just down to 1 or 2 cells left. Or that's if you're just going to leave it intact. If you want to make splits, you just make sure each split, you just divide all the resources equally. And you can perform up to 2 to 3 splits with that colony, just depending on how much brood and honey and resources were available and how much equipment you got, what your plans are. But when I'm in production mode, I typically do at least 2, an additional split divided in half, and I've got a queen cell in each of those, at least 1 or 2. So visually, May 8th, a week later, you're looking at this queen right nuke, making sure everything's fine, and the left colony, the mature but queenless colony that's got queen cells in it, you're just culling down to 1 or 2 cells. And that's all you do. You put it back together. You got to be gentle with those cells, not shaking those frames. It's a delicate time for the queen. So just being careful that way. So essentially, typically, you started with 1 overwintered colony and now you've got 3. And you start doing the math. And 3 weeks later, most often 95% of the time, those queens are going to get mated successfully. And for the most part, you're going to have 3 queen right colonies that are all going to be mature a month later. It's amazing how fast they build up under this kind of impulse in the early spring. So to stop for some questions, where do you put the new nukes after splitting? I don't worry about that. I stick them wherever I want in the apiary. They handle it just fine. I used to worry about it, would move them to another yard, or I'd move it just a foot a day or whatever. I don't even worry about it. You just immediately put it wherever you want, and it doesn't make any difference. They do just fine. I never had issues with that. How do you determine which queen cells to cull? That's subjective. Good question, Deborah. I typically go for the largest, well-formed, peanut-looking cells that are in a good spot, higher up on the frame where I notch typically. I don't want them like at the very bottom where they could get smushed in my manipulations. Just kind of whatever you feel comfortable with. There's no real right. I certainly wouldn't keep a small one. I want the big ones full of royal jelly. So that's the first strategy, is making an artificial swarm. That's to mitigate, as you think about it, it mitigates swarming. You've artificial swarmed all your colonies. They're not going to swarm, and you're not going to lose bees. You're not going to lose honey. And you've mitigated swarming, and in the process, increased your colonies. And you may be saying, well, I don't want extra colonies. Well, you can always recombine them, kill a queen and recombine them a month later, and you got a super powerhouse honey builder, because you got 2 queens raising brood for a month or 2, and you just combine with newspaper right when the flow starts, and you're going to have more honey than you can deal with on your hands, and make more than you would have otherwise. It's kind of counterintuitive. Do small cells indicate an inferior queen? I don't know. Typically, it tells me something's wrong. You want a lot of royal jelly and good development with the queen cell. Sometimes they make extra long, and that also is a sign of weird. You just want a normal looking, standard, large queen cell and no aberrations, all looking the same. That's just been my subjective strategy. So a few problems as we think about raising queens. Again, a reliance on outside breeders. Grafting can be complex. It's definitely you can learn it. I've learned it and done it successfully. It takes a lot of work and tools and time and steps. This is much easier, in my opinion, unless you're going to be a queen producer. That changes the game potentially. Many feel inadequate about the idea of raising quality queens, and so buying bees ends up being the easiest option for most beekeepers. So The strategy defined is rather than relying on purchasing bees and queens, as you've seen, you can raise instead your own quality queens and make splits as needed. So it begs the question, how do my queens in this process compare with queens shipped that I've paid 30, 40, 50 bucks from California or Georgia? And I have to honestly say, after all these years, after doing both a lot, I can't tell any difference. They're just as strong, just as powerful layers. Raise as much honey as either way. It's the same process. OTS gets a bad knock, as some say it's introducing a emergency impulse, but I would counter and say you do the same thing to raise queens in whatever process. You're forcing the bees to make queens in your artificial scenario. So you're doing the same. You're taking advantage of the same impulse in either direction. So via this OTS queen rearing method and notching, you're creating your own nukes. You're allowing strong colonies to raise actually less queens than a larger colony, a cell builder colony would be in a queen producing yard. So what is OTS queen rearing? What does it mean? It just means Mel thought, how can I teach people to raise their own queens right there in the apiary with no extra tools in a minute or two? And this is how he came up with the idea on the spot, queen rearing right there and then on the spot. A couple questions first. If you notch, are your queen cells bigger than if you don't for emergency cells? I don't really notice any different. Since they will raise their own queen, what is the advantage of notching? Good question. Some people don't even notch anymore and don't have issues. I have seen a couple times when I've not notched where they didn't get the picture and they were on old comb and just didn't get at it in time, and I have to do something different. So I just notch for the heck of it, just to make sure, cover my bases. If it's comb that looks like this, they're going to raise cells almost every time. If it's fresh, young comb on a new frame like this, they just invariably raise a cell wherever you've notched. We'll get into that a little bit more. Let's talk about the notch actually. So this step one, you're looking for this type. If you look in the middle of that left picture, you can see that's your ideal grafting age larva, have just emerged, haven't started really growing much yet, and they're just in a little tiny pool of royal jelly at the bottom of that cell, and that will change quickly in just a few hours. So you have to take advantage of that quick. That's the type of larva that the bees will naturally go. They'll find the youngest larva and raise cells if they've got the choice. And step two is you take your hive tool and you just push straight in at the bottom third of that cell wall and just crush it downwards. You can be even a little bit more ruthless than that picture appears there. I typically bend even more down and they'll repair that really quickly. And you'll find a couple of queen cells there. That's what the notch looks like. You'll come back a week later and they'll look like this. It'll be 1, 2, or 3 cells, typically at least one. And when you are notching, especially on this darker comb, you have to be careful to cut through the cocoons that have built up over time. It takes a little bit of a sawing motion left to right. And you may have to make sure to get all the way down to the plastic or the base of the foundation and then rip it downwards. And that's actually the mistake I think a lot of folks are making and not seeing notches work, because they're not notching all the way to the foundation and ripping it down significantly. And it just instructs the bees, hey, build a queen cell here. That's what if they're going to build a queen cell there, they're going to have to destroy the bottom of that cell and start building downwards. That's just their natural behavior. So you're kind of doing the work for them. Deborah says, I see the advantages placing notches on frames I intend to move for splits. Yes, I forgot about that. If you notch on multiple frames, that allows you to make splits. If you just leave it up to them, sometimes you're only going to have queen cells on one frame, and then it's not going to allow you to split that colony up into multiple colonies. That's really important. Good point. James actually said that. Jason says, when you notch and take the bottom out of the cell, it allows for the queen to hang down more naturally in the cell. That's true. Yeah, just gives them space. Good points. So here's a few OTS queen pictures a few years ago from the group, the Facebook group that was mentioned. And there's a lot of good help in there. There's 4 or 5 admins, myself and 3 or 4 others that will answer questions if you ever got them. And they're generally, we try and keep it a happy group and just boot folks if they're antagonistic so you can feel comfortable asking questions. Have I ever practiced queen clipping? I haven't. Why OTS works? One, there's 4 pages of this, actually 4 things. Your bees can outbreed the mites with brood breaks. So this is part of the strategy. We'll get into more about mite mitigation. And as well as post-solstice queens are allowed to lay like a spring queen. So there's 2 times, here's an important thing to grasp. There's 2 times in the beekeeping year, typically, that you're going to want to try OTS. The first is early in the spring to mitigate swarms. And when that happens, your colonies that have low mite volume, low mite, what's the word, whatever. You have few mites, they will obviously quickly mate and extrapolate their numbers quickly. But the most important reason for the OTS at that point is just splitting colonies and preventing swarms. The second time for OTS is around summer solstice, which is obviously around June 21st, 22nd. And the old timers, Miller, Doolittle, etc., learned in their scientific research and experience that for some reason that queens that are bred around or after the solstice, when they begin to lay again after they've been mated, the colony behaves like it's a spring colony. It builds up very quickly. I would submit even quicker than a spring colony at times, just depending on the flow. And so that's one way. It's counterintuitive. A lot of folks don't like to do OTS in the fall or in the late summer because they think there's no way these new colonies are going to be strong enough to get through the winter, and it's just isn't so. They ramp up in a month's time, and it will surprise you, knock your socks off. So your broodless colonies will, in a normal flow, also pull in good amounts of honey, having no brood to rear for a month. This is another benefit of OTS with these brood breaks, is they've got no brood to rear for a month. What are they going to do? They're going to fill the colony with honey, which you actually have to make sure they've got a bit of space to lay when she returns mated. But it's a good problem to have. Extra honey, everybody will take that. It's probably one of the reasons why you're doing beekeeping. 2, with the ability to make easy quality increase, you now have all the resources you need. Every healthy colony you overwinter can easily become 8 or more colonies by fall. Yeah. So this is my first overwinter colony in March. It's healthy. We get to May and it's got 6 or 8 frames of brood. I split it into 3. And then again, I do OTS in June or early July even. And by end of August, I've got 8 or more colonies by fall if I'm splitting them heavy. And obviously you're not going to have as much honey in this kind of ramp up mode, but it just depends on what your goals are. You can do any mixture of ideas here. You could keep some for honey and some for colony increase. Just depends what your goals are. Do you have any suggestions, Deborah asks, for being able to see eggs? That's a whole nother discussion hour, I think. Glasses are hard for me. I'm starting to need them, but they fog up. So I'm actually in that kind of mode asking the same question. The newer the foundation, or the newer the wax, the easier it is to see. So sometimes that means cycling through your wax a little quicker is going to help you a lot. I was dreaming one day about how fast I could ramp up colonies if I really wanted to. And if I had one spring, I had 31 healthy colonies sitting in the yard, and I thought, how much could I, using this principle, if I got 8 out of those, and on average, I'd have over 240 colonies going into winter. It's so amazing how fast you can ramp up using this method. And just do the math on what do those queens cost if you were to order all those queens to do the splits, and that's kind of prohibitive. why OTS works. You're raising local bees from your local survivors. So anytime you're keeping the mating in your local area and having control over the quality of the queens as you see them produce and lay and raise honey, and sometimes you'll have one that's mean and get rid of them quick, or building up way too much propolis. If you don't, that's not your thing, get rid of them and try again. It just depends on your goals. You're no longer participating in that genetic bottleneck. And then lastly, you're no longer relying on synthetic and harsh chemicals. So one of the big things Mel focused on earlier with this was trying to do this system that's easy, but also that would allow the beekeeper to take care of mites and without the chemicals. And when we do that brood break twice in the year, that can go a long ways, if not all the way, towards mitigating mites for the most part in your apiary. And that's been my experience. The last few years, I've gone a little bit to oxalic or formic, some organic chemical, but I don't rely on it. And for the most part, I just do without. And just depending on what's taking place. I did put some formic on once, just a half dose this last fall and moving out to the farm here. So Philip asked, do you find that there are enough stores for autumn and winter with all the extra post-solstice bees? Yeah, I do. I typically like to fill a box for each colony, and I don't like to feed at all. I don't spend any money on sugar, except I do buy a few bags at most for making sugar blocks for the winter, and just more of an emergency late winter, early spring if there's crazy weather. And I'll show you how I do that. So some caveats here as you think about this splitting and raising queen cells. And this is where it's important to think about these. This is where a lot of people fall down. A lot of beekeepers skip steps, change it a little bit, and try and get those little nucleuses to raise queen cells, and it won't work. You can have inferior queens or unmated queens. So only strong colonies can raise a queen cell. So going back to those splits that you're doing, you want to make sure they're just the queen and a couple frames of brood and bees, and that's it. And you got to be satisfied with that. You want that queenless colony to have all the bees and have all the resources going into those few queen cells that they're going to make. Otherwise, you're going to have inferior queens. You only want to notch when good queen rearing conditions are present. So good weather, there's drones present, you've got good feed in the colonies, they're not low on stores. A lot of beekeepers fall down with OTS and notch too soon, and that ends in poorly mated queens as well. Or you wait too long and you get swarm cells going. So there's a little bit of a balance there of watching the weather, especially making sure you're doing it at the proper time. You usually got a week or two window. Any queen rearing operations will see at least 10 to 15% mating loss, and that's no different for the big producers as well. It's just the way it is. You're going to get some eaten by birds or whatever. Proper notching is another set of caveats here. Proper notching is required to be effective. We mentioned that all the way to the bottom of the cell, and then be a little bit ruthless with clearing away below the cell. It's got to be proper aged larvae. I think a lot of folks are notching older larvae. So that's something to be aware of and to practice. Leaving colonies alone during the queen rearing period. Folks like to get in and mess around during that week of cell building, and that's a no-no. Patience is required. If you hit the 35th day, you're going to likely see laying workers or a queen that didn't get mated well, and different bee groups are going to say different things about what to do with a laying worker colony. I just get rid of them and use the resources in other colonies. Mite monitoring with the alcohol wash is still recommended, even though this works without. For the most part, you still want to be testing, especially if you're new to beekeeping and you're not necessarily your observation skills, noticing what's taking place, signs of bees having issues with mites, which means it's kind of too late anyways, but you want to be testing. Whatever your recommendations are in the group, make sure you're doing that. Deborah asks, I'm in Georgia and at solstice we're already in a dearth. I'm told I just have to feed like crazy. Opinion, yeah, I mean, you may wait longer in the year to do that fall mating. If you've got a late fall flow and the weather's fine, you might push your luck holding off, holding off and doing that a little bit later. I'm not sure the dynamics, to be honest. I'd have to look at your forage and how long, what the weather looks like for you into the fall. Brian asks, when do you do OTS around summer solstice? Are you killing that queen or just putting her in a nuke? It's a good question. In the spring, we're obviously keeping those queens and making nukes. In the fall, I'm actually killing every queen in the yard, and that people's eyebrows will raise with that. But you're actually going into winter with all new queens, and it's also counterintuitive, and it feels very risky. The first year or two I did it, thought I was crazy and nuts, and Mel was nuts, and I'm gonna lose all my bees. But now I don't even think twice about it. It does feel risky. So what I would suggest is try it on a couple, and you'll see, and you'll start to gain confidence. Jason's got a good idea there as well. I would agree with that. That's a good possibility as well. And others are selling their queens. That also works very well. Just depends on your time and goals. So the third strategy for controlling mites, we've already talked a lot about it, but your colonies obviously are going to build their mite populations up. As you get towards July and August is the crux of the problem. Is when the mites are going to, if they're there and increasing and not being taken care of, they're going to outbreed the bees, and you're going to have a collapsing colony, and you're going to get sickness and a lot of issues, and it can spread to other colonies, obviously. So you can't ignore that, and you have to deal with it somehow, and you might as well deal with them naturally as possible, which is kind of the focus of your group, and I would agree with it. And the basic premise here is that brood break, what you're doing is you get rid of the queen in the late summer in June around the solstice, and they're going to finish capping all the open brood. You're going to have no open brood, and all the mites are going to jump into those cells. Most of the mites will, and because they jump into the cell, the larva, right before they're capped. That's the trigger, the pheromones, whatever takes place there with those growing larvae. That's when the mites jump in, and so they can mate, lay, and die and reproduce, etc. So what you're doing is taking advantage of that impulse, and you're having a catastrophic loss of the mites. When they get into the cells, there's too many mites, and a lot of them will die just from not having enough larvae. So you're sacrificing some larvae to mitigate mites as well. For a whole month, you have no queen laying in that colony, so the mites are on standstill. Even if all the mites survived, those mites have nowhere to lay for a month until the new queen comes in and starts laying, and it gives the colony a break and allows them to mitigate the mites a little easier. So I've also, if you're going to use oxalic, there's an optimal time, and it allows you to use less oxalic vapor if it interests you, and that would be on the 24th day after you've killed the queen. And all the bees that have been in the cells have emerged, and that would include the drones. They take a little longer to emerge, 24 days. So on the 24th, 25th day is when you would shoot your vapor, and you'd only need to do it once. Whereas typically, if you've got a laying queen, you have to do 3 subsequent treatments over a 3-week period to get all the bees, all the mites, and that's a lot of dosage. With this, it's just one shot at, you're going to get all the mites are going to be phoretic, hanging out on bees if there's any left, and you can get them once with oxalic and use a lot less impact on the colony. Something to talk about as a group to test. Post-solstice magic. Raising queens in July, won't that cause problems? How will my colony be strong enough to produce honey and overwinter? So, as we said, the secret is that queens mated post-solstice will perform like a new spring queen. It's amazing. Do I really believe this? Yes, enough to remove every queen in my yard in July, most every year now since learning the OTS method in 2012. And each year I get into September here in Ohio, and this is what my yard looks like. Those colonies have produced 2 to 3 or even 4 boxes of bees, and it's really quite amazing and full of honey in the top, ready to get prepped for winter, which I've done here. You can see I've got a spacer at top of these colonies to handle sugar blocks later in the early spring, late winter. I'm going to skip to a year in my apiary for time's sake. This is just, I'm going to just visually show you how I did all this in my apiary over the course of a beekeeping year, just to help wrap this up. So in fall of 2018, I wrapped up 38 hives to overwinter, and all with these new July mated queens through the OTS method. So they're all, queens just a couple months old going into fall. I winterized with a wrap, tar paper, sugar spacer at the top, upper ventilation. Don't worry about the upper ventilation now, not so much, don't really care. Top insulation, I use year-round insulated covers. I just continue to use those through the winter. I love them. And then the mouse guard, of course. And so my colonies kind of look like this typically. This is an early spring snowfall, Cleveland area. And you can see the bees are at the top and needing some stores. So I've given them some sugar blocks. So in the winter of 2018, going into March, 31 of those hives survived, pretty decent. I did notice some beetles that spring, which was odd to have them that early. And I had been feeding dry sugar on newspaper for the first time instead of sugar blocks. So I went back, I didn't do that again. I think that was the issue. Anyways, we had crazy weather patterns that made a big dent in brood rearing. So we had issues with colony strength. I was selling bees that year. This was in a neighborhood on a postage stamp yard, by the way. I backed up to railroad tracks, which allowed me like 20 by 40 space to do this. That's why I only had 40 or 50 hives there. Don't tell the city. Spring 2019, I'm definitely not going to sell as many healthy nukes as I'd like, so I canceled half my orders. I don't like selling product that's not perfect. And May 4th, I artificial swarmed that year. It was very early, and sold 12 nukes and spot checked for mites. May 11th, a week later, I came back and did splits with those queen cells. I destroyed a few, combined a few weak colonies. I don't mess around anymore with those, and that left me with 27 queenless colonies with cells, most medium strength. That's because I sold off all my nukes. Otherwise, I would have had a bunch more nucleus colonies in the yard with queens. May 25th, I applied a dose of oxalic, and that was the only dose that year. June 1st, 25 strong laying colonies, so that I had 92% mating success, pretty typical. I spent a lot of time rubbing wax on new foundation because I'm selling bees, getting rid of frames. In the summer, I made a little bit effort to sell some additional nukes, got 6 requests, so I sold a few. I artificial swarmed 6 colonies to sell thus, and remaining queens were removed, killed them all, and I banked 4, as someone mentioned. You can bank them, a few of them, for a backup, just as a test. So I had 25 queenless colonies. July 14th, came back a week later, split the cells and bees into 40 colonies. Well, I did give another dose of oxalic that year on the 30th, 20 days. That was a little bit too early. I think that's a mistype. August 10th, 36 of 40 made it successful, 90%. That's typical in the late summer. You're going to get a little bit more predation on your queens. I used 3 banked queens to raise that to 39 queen right colonies. That's how I sell my nukes and the easy nukes. And then August, all the colonies did well with honey and extracted some, focused on some comb building. September, colonies are progressing, all have 2+ deeps. In October, all the hive weights were pretty nice, all but 4, which I fed a bit, which is not typical. And I added sugar rims and then went into the winter with 39. So you can see the power of, that's my sugar spacer. So despite mistakes and beetles and a bad spring, I sold 200 jars of honey, made a few bucks. I sold 18 nukes, made a bunch of money, raised 50 quality queens for free. They're worth, to me, $1,000 or more if you can go buy those in the market, and then entered winter with the same number of healthy bees. So just 4 quick suggestions and then questions. 4 suggestions just kind of related to this would be standardize your equipment. If you're going to do this kind of work, you want all your frames the same size. basically. So I run all deeps. You could run all mediums, whatever. You can have issues if you're doing. It's just more complicated otherwise, and you're not going to have as many options to move brood and bees and honey around if you're not using queen excluders, and that's just more work itself as well. So I don't use any of that. It's just all open. Be ruthless with struggling colonies. It's something that's learned behavior and process, and it pays off, I think. Winterize well, and then plan for loss, which is normal. It's the whole system is you're not worried about losses anymore, and you can afford to lose some bees and not worry so much. So questions. Can you do oxalic treatments with honey supers on? You're not supposed to if you're selling it. I honestly don't think there's any issues. I mean, oxalic comes from rhubarb leaves or Japanese knotweed, and it's a very tiny low dose for human consumption that you're applying, but there's law you have to consider. How do you bank a queen? I have little 2 and 4 frame nucleus boxes that you can just put that queen on the frame she came in, and a frame of honey in there, and on just 2 frames you can hold her for a month, and she'll raise a frame or 2 of brood in the meantime. And so you can make use of her later and just combine those bees with another colony. Laird says, do you normally apply oxalic via vapor, or do you also do a drizzle? I've only ever tried vapor. I have a nice gun for that. I've never tried drizzle. Some people swear by that, so I don't know, it's subjective. Finding a queen can be a challenge, Barbara asked. Can you give us more insight on how you do this? Yeah, I think the time saver is learning to get to the freshest laid eggs as possible and start there. And also, maybe not really, most folks don't realize this, maybe sometimes you're smoking too heavy and making that queen run. So smoke lightly helps. Good light in the middle of the day helps. And then looking for trusting your eyes and not spending too much time per frame can help a lot. It's rare that you sit there and look and then find her. It's more often you see her right away, and you just got to trust yourself. Tammy asked, do you pull honey from first year hives? Definitely. I would start a little at a time, take a frame or 2. If they're filling up a box, you want to give them space and room to work anyway. So it's actually helping them. That's why I just pulled 100 pounds a couple days ago from 14 to 15 hives, just giving them some space and room. That's one way to do it. Just progressively do it. And you don't have all the honey to do all at once. That's how I do it. All right. Any other questions before James takes over? There's a few things I could point at, and that would be Mel's book again at NDA Splitter. I don't get anything from Mel. I don't talk to Mel much at all unless I see him at a conference, and just want to help him and for all he's done for my apiary. OTS Facebook group, that's the link. And then that at the bee farm, there's a good article, just a rehash, 7 keys for successful OTS that might be interested for you guys. And there's other posts about OTS as well. Sergey asked one more, are your hives double deeps or single deeps? I would love to get to just single deep like Ian Steffler does and others, but I don't have the time for it yet. I may get to that point, but I just let them have at it. So I usually got 2 boxes of brood, sometimes more. I've got a 5 boxer out there right now. You're most welcome.
Thanks, John. Appreciate it. Very helpful information as far as the OTS method is concerned. And you pointed out on a couple of occasions how you've modified the approach for, your needs and, added to some of the principles that you've learned from the OTS method in general. And I think that kind of speaks a lot to just beekeeping as a whole. The saying that, you ask 3 beekeepers a question or 10 beekeepers a question, and you get 11 answers or 20 answers, or however the cliche goes anymore. I think it's true because there's not only just one answer to most questions. And I'm fond of assessing questions on what I'm doing based on my goals. And when it comes to OTS, you know, if my goal specifically is to end up with as many colonies as possible, should I dispatch the queens, right? Like, so if I want to maintain those queens and, you know, risk going into winter with them, then I do, and I move them on. You know, that just kind of is my modification to the approach. I don't often remarry them back to the original colony. Sometimes they end up in there because the requeening failed, and the original, you know, OTS approach to the large colony that was split from, that queen got eaten by a dragonfly, or she couldn't find the entrance back. Who knows? Or she was poorly mated, you know, and maybe didn't mate at all and only lasted a few weeks and started laying drone cells. So there's so many variables. So based on your goals, ask yourself those questions. How does this relate to what my goal is for the season? And, you know, the thing with OTS is in Michigan is helping you prepare for winter right away. I think your day one, you should be prepping for winter when it comes to beekeeping. Yeah. So if anybody had any additional follow-up questions or any additional beekeeping questions that they wanted to raise that we could answer and that John could answer, and we'd be happy to field those questions for you and give you a few minutes to kind of think about that, if John hasn't already answered it for you. For those that did attend, if you have registered at the Sustainable Beekeepers Guild website shop for the presentation, you'll receive an email with the presentation once I get the video from the cloud and put in there for you to receive. You'll have access to that at least for the next month or so. If you are a Bee Guild member, you'll have that in perpetuity for as long as you have the annual membership. John's presentations are also available on YouTube, so you can find those in historical context as well. Josh asked, if it's a very strong hive, could you split it into more than two in that case?
Yeah, definitely. You can do some colonies. I've done 3 and 4 splits from it, and you just want to make sure there's enough resources, nurse bees. You want to split the resources up and not have any one of the splits raising a lot of brood without enough bees. That's be the only risk. And so you just split the brood up, split the stores up, and you should be good to go.
Yeah, and if I've got 6 frames of brood on the first split of the season, the very, you know, first May, early May, mid-May split, I might do 2, right?
Yeah, that's typical.
This season was really weird. I only had about 4 or 5 frames of brood, and I wanted to run those colonies for production. So my goal for those colonies to run them for honey production dictated that I need to leave as many bees as possible after I split the home queen out, as I like to call the donor queen, and left the donor colony queenless.
Right.
But if there were 8 frames of brood, I could essentially take that queen out and do the notching, come back, and hopefully there's at least 3 frames with queens on them. I can make 3 more additional splits.
That's right.
With 1 to 2 brood frames. So
yeah, Laird and Kelly, sugar bricks. Basically, how I do that is I add 1.5 ounces of water to pound of sugar, mix that up. It's kind of the consistency of oatmeal, or a little heavier than that, and I just put that into paper bowls, small paper bowls that will fit in at the top of my spacer, a couple inch tall spacer. I let those dry overnight, a couple days. They get rock hard, and you can store them all winter long and just use them as you need. And the nice thing about it is you can move those around to wherever the colony is moving around, and so they don't have to migrate to go get feed, and there's less issues that way. I don't ever feed pollen patties or winter patties. I let the weather dictate.
Yeah, pollen patties are tricky. They get you to build that brood up quicker than the weather may dictate, and you end up with swarms sooner than your colony can sustain, or you end up with too much brood and they can't feed themselves because they can't get out to gather resources, and then you're stuck in a perpetual feeding pattern. There's a lot of nuances that come with that. So Thanks again, John. I appreciate it so very much. A reminder
bet.
for everybody how to connect with the Sustainable Beekeepers Guild. It's our website. Membership's $10 for an individual, 15 for a family. You get multiple members with that. And there's the links for our Facebook groups. And as far as email, info@sbgmi.org. And then John's email was posted earlier on in the presentation, and he's pretty easy to find if you Google him. All right. Appreciate everybody coming. Thanks, John. Have a good night. We'll be in touch with you soon. Take care.